Thank you everyone for joining. So we're going to start in a couple of minutes. We're just waiting to give some time for other people to join, and so we'll start properly in 1 minute. Thank you. Before we start, I'd like to share some instructions on interpretation. As you can see here, interpretation is available in French and also Spanish. The event will be done fully in English with one speaker speaking Spanish. So to make interpretation available, you can see the globe at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And there you can click the language that you would like to hear. And to only hear the interpreted language you want, click mute original audio. But first you have to make sure that you have in your meeting controls the option for interpretation. We also have live transcript available, but only in English, unfortunately. You can choose to have live transcripts by clicking on your meeting controls and then click and show subtitles. To view the full transcript, click on the view full transcript option, and to change the size of the text, click subtitle settings and change it to large. So I'll hand it over to our moderator, Ishita. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Umaira. Very good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all of you. My name is Ishita Datta. I work as a program manager at the International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific, a global South international feminist women's rights organization that is a member of the Observatory on the Universality of our Rights. To set the context for today's discussion that aims to shed light on the concerted and systematic attacks, particularly on rights related to gender and sexuality in human rights spaces at the local, national, and global levels, I had planned to begin by expressing my deep gratitude and admiration for all the women's rights and human rights activists who are organizing tirelessly in the face of extreme odds to ensure that the terms justice, dignity, human rights, and women's rights are not rendered meaningless. Today, many of us woke up to the sudden loss of a fearless activist from Palestine, Suha Jarar. In the spirit of remembrance as resistance, I would like to begin by inviting all of you to observe a moment of silence for Suha. Thank you, everyone. I would now like to lead us all into today's discussion titled Rights at Risk, Time for Action. Our first speaker today is Umaira Ahmed. Umaira is a coordinator of the Advancing Universal Rights and Justice Initiative at AVID. Her work focuses on challenging fascisms and fundamentalisms and advancing rights related to gender and sexuality in UN human rights spaces. The floor is yours, Umaira.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Shita, and thank you so much again for everyone that's here today. So just to start, the whole reason why you're here today and why we're organizing this event is not only in conjunction with the most recent Rights at Risk Time for Action report that has been launched in mid-June, but also to talk a bit more about the trends that we are seeing in human rights spaces, specifically as it relates to the rise of nationalism and also fundamentalisms. So it goes without saying that around the world, rights related to gender and sexuality are profoundly and distinctively impacted from the consolidation and also collision of nationalisms, diverse and evolving forms of fundamentalisms, corporate capture of the state, and also white supremacy and neocolonialism. Government responses to COVID clearly demonstrated this. We saw the state and non-state actors instrumentalize the crisis to basically deprioritize sexual and reproductive health services as non-essential services, and also to crack down on feminist and social movement organizing. It's very clear that the dominant economic model underpinning government responses to COVID puts profit above human life and has had the most devastating consequences for women, the poor working class immigrants, the disabled, and also those in the global south. This same community, however, have constantly been scapegoated for the crisis. While this manifests in different ways across regions and countries, rights related to gender and sexuality are a central occupation of nationalist and fundamentalist ideologies and also discourse. Patriarchy and its family unit, always heteronormative and productive oriented, are cornerstones, and gender justice, bodily autonomy, and integrity are seen as threats. So in human rights spaces, pushing back against persistent attacks and regression on rights related to gender and sexuality is an ongoing struggle for feminist and also social justice movements. Where strides forward have been made, backlash ensues. And the two Rights at Risk reports are really borne out the recognition of these systemic threats. The Observatory, as Ishita had mentioned earlier, have been doing this work for a long time to monitor the different trends that are ongoing within the UN and also nationally. And what we're seeing is that in the UN, state and non-state actors are really mobilizing together to push back on rights with increasing coordination, resources, and also mobilization. So for example, in the recent Where is the Money report published by AWIT, it was noted that in the US, over $280 million from the Christian right funded activities to undermine human rights in the UN, also colluding with conservative states and other anti-rights actors. On the other hand, around half of feminist organizations in the global south are operating with an annual budget of $30,000 or less. Not only is this outrageous, it really presents a real threat to the capacity and ability of feminists and social justice movements to organize within the human rights space. What we are really seeing from the anti-rights side is that a complex web of transnational alliances that are able to work across issues and instrumentalize gender and sexuality to undermine the content and structure of the human rights system as a whole, and especially its ability to ensure accountability for all human rights violations. So what's the exact tactic that's used by anti-rights actors to block advancement on rights related to gender and sexuality in human rights spaces, and what's the impact? So like I mentioned earlier, a lot of this, and we'll have our colleague Morena later speak to the trends at the national level, but they really resonate with what's going on nationally and also globally. But within the UN itself, anti-rights actors are engaging in human rights systems with no real intention of strengthening rights protections, but instead to undermine them. Some tactics are more subtle than others, while some are more brazen. In order to water down the content of our rights, one common practice for states is to claim that rights protection related to gender and sexuality are incompatible with religious, cultural, and traditional values. So what this manifests in the Human Rights Council, for example, is the blocking of inclusion of sexual reproductive health and rights in resolutions, and which also resounds nationally, where religious, cultural, and traditional values are used to justify discriminatory practices. Another thing that we see states doing is co-opting human rights language in social justice struggles. So instead of speaking openly against rights related to gender and sexuality, they're able to mask it under a veneer of respectability and manipulate well-accepted human rights concepts to push for anti-rights agendas. So for example, in this Human Rights Council session, we saw a group of states bring together a statement on protection of the family. What it did essentially was instrumentalize the COVID-19 pandemic to push for family-oriented policies. This is a part of a long-term effort to bring forward the resolution or protection of the family in order to normalize this language while also framing it as seemingly harmless, while also the framing is seemingly harmless on the surface. By advocating for protection of the family unit, this attempt really refuses to recognize that because of patriarchy and economic equality, the family can also be a site of violence. And what it tries to do in the bigger scale is try to shift norms, try to shift rights from the individual to the family, an already powerful institution. Also, what we are seeing on the other hand as well is that rights related to gender and sexuality are also being co-opted by actors that are not seemingly very anti-rights, so to speak. So we have concepts such as universality being co-opted, and also intersectionality at sometimes to avoid addressing discrimination, particularly in relation to racism, and in order to address the history of colonization. So while some states might champion this language, you can see on the other hand, in other forums, for example, recently we saw France and the GF, who in the HRC, they are very open towards using language intersectionality. In the Generation Equality, a whole forum supposedly dedicated to gender equality commitments, they blatantly rejected intersectional politics, supposedly in the name of universalism, to avoid acknowledging deep and structural racism in the country. We also saw this in the session last year in the Human Rights Council, where the European bloc also paid lip service to intersectionality by refusing to hold the United States accountable for systemic racism and police violence during the urgent debate. Then we move on to how anti-rights actors are non-state actors and how they are mobilizing in these spaces. So a lot of feminist activists have noted that while these anti-rights actors have been very active in New York, especially in spaces like CSW, we're now seeing this trend arrive in Geneva, where feminist organizations face threats from reprisals and growing corporate power. Because of their resources, anti-rights actors are able to be everywhere, and so their access to power is really vast. Because they mask their agendas with neutral sounding names, most of them have ECOSOC status and are able to disrupt CSO participation freely. Because they know how to co-opt human rights language, their alliances with the UN and some feminist groups are growing. They lobby for key positions, and they're able to train a mass number of infiltrators. So some of the discourse that we see as being used is similar to state actors, where there's a real element of co-optation of our rights. So for example, you see the exploitation of disability justice being used to push back against sexual reproductive health and rights and the right to abortion. For example, in this recent informal in the Violence Against Women resolution for the 47 Human Rights Council, we saw anti-rights actors like Alliance Defending Freedom using this similar rhetoric. And it's also quite common for these kind of actors to organize events in CSW to pit rights of people with disabilities and the right to sexual reproductive and health rights by framing the latter, for example, as instances of prenatal genocide. Another very common tactic is used by non-state anti-rights actors and also state anti-rights actors is the creation of new rights in response to what is perceived or what is framed as threats. So for example, we see the persistent attempt to construct what we call parental rights as a category to be pitted against sexual and reproductive health rights, in particular, comprehensive sexuality education. We also see that attempts to advance rights related to gender and sexuality is increasingly described as a part of an ideology. This is a part of a larger rhetoric where rights defenders are being portrayed as threatening society and imposing their values. We also saw this was used as a basis to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention. Another example I'd like to give is from where I'm from myself. In Malaysia, in 2019, during its Universal Periodic Review, NGO, supposedly a women's rights organization, mobilized to justify the right to participate in conversion therapy or as rehabilitation, as well as framing this conversion therapy as a right of individuals to exercise freedom of religion and belief by queer individuals. Not only does this present the deliberate misuse of freedom of religion and belief, but it also shows how these anti-rights actors take notes from each other in international spaces to ensure that they can continue to operate with impunity at the national level. From the outside, we're also seeing anti-rights actors being very vocal about attacks on the UN. So for example, last year we saw them launch campaigns and media engagement to delegitimize the UN and stop their funding. So petitions were launched against specific special procedure mandates and claiming that they're acting beyond their power, and also attacking the UN overall as an undemocratic body. One of their main demands was also to call for defunding of the UN. This is already in the context where funding is a serious challenge faced by special procedures and the human rights system as a whole. With anti-rights mobilization and also corporate capture, not only is the system's capacity of accountability weakened, but it also means that the concept of rights and safety of activists to engage in this space is seriously threatened. The UN space is full of barriers for feminist marginalized communities, especially from the global south. But at the same time, the progress in gender and sexuality that we see in this space is because of feminist labor resistance and creativity in pushing forward. So in terms of the specific opportunities and strategies that we see to counter anti-rights actors in the UN, just to backtrack, the Rights at Risk report was born of the recognition that to counter the advance of human rights opponents, we really need tools to fight back collectively. This requires having an intimate knowledge of the ways they operate, and which also serves as a complementary tactic to the advancing other resisting strategies work done by feminist movements at different levels, internationally, regionally, and nationally. By zooming out and offering a bird's eye view of the shifting trends and threats posed by nationalism and also fundamentalisms, the report offers a feminist power analysis and maps the transnational anti-rights lobby, the connections of power, their resources, and strategy. This report also really hopes to support groups in talking back. So we found that while we may know we may know that these arguments are being co-opted, we might not have them all at hand. And where it's clear for us as a feminist movement that certain concepts are being co-opted, they might not be so clear for other movements, especially considering the more subtle ways that anti-rights actors are framing their discourse. And so the report debunks and demystifies narratives put forward by anti-rights actors. It's also very clear that we really need to build across context, regions, and also issues. The report demonstrates the distinct ways in which anti-rights actors are building this way. And we are too, but we really need to strengthen these connections. With the threat that we're up against, we need to organize collectively, leveraging on our different entry points, strategies, and narratives. So what there's really to say is that our approach has to be intentionally holistic, not only in bringing different movements together, but also the framework that we're using. We have to break down silos, and feminist movements have been saying this for ages. And there is a real value in the bigger picture analysis and cross-movement mobilization. Anti-rights actors and fundamentalisms and nationalisms are an existential threat across a range of rights, not just in gender and sexuality, and we need to have a joined up response to match that. Just before I close, I'd like to share the call to action that the Observatory had launched in conjunction with the report. The call to action calls on collective mobilization against the anti-rights side as a matter of urgency and priority. This call to action really hopes that mandate holders and states uphold the universality of right, and take concrete action to reject all attempts to pit the rights of any one group against the other. And the report can help as a tool to map these different issues. And we also call on states to stop co-opting our rights language, and also terms such as universalism, which also means that states need to stop cherry picking rights conveniently. And for UN actors, this means that we need to break down silos that protect rights related to gender and sexuality. We also need to prioritize meaningful collaboration with feminist and social justice movements. We also call on states and UN actors to resist the legitimization of anti-rights actors under the guise of human rights organization, and take all possible measures to stop their access to decision-making positions. I think I'm over time, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Umaira. And sorry to rush you at the end there. There was a lot to get through, and that was a very, very comprehensive overview of drawing connections on the organizing of anti-rights actors from the global level to the local level. And I think it's really interesting, the key trends that you highlighted around co-optation of human rights language, around instrumentalization of human rights language, pitting human rights language against each other, as well as the sheer amount of funding that is being poured into the mobilization of these anti-rights actors that have very real ramifications on rights related to gender and sexuality and other rights at the national level. And so I hope to shed more light on that perspective. I can invite our second speaker for the evening, Ms. Morena Herrera. Morena is a feminist and human rights activist. Morena has participated in different national organizations and regional networks that defend women's human rights. She is a founding member of Las Líneas and a member of the Colectiva Feminista para el Desarrollo Local, feminist collective for local development, where she currently coordinates training and knowledge management practices. Over to you, Morena.
Buenos días.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a pleasure to encounter you all here. I am Morena Herrera. I live in Central America, which is a region in the center of the American continent, where when coronavirus came, we found ourselves in a region that was already in a crisis. It was already in a crisis due to an economic and political model in which violence and extractivist pillage is the predominant tenor, and the violences that impact our lives, our bodies, and our territories run rampant. I situate myself in this region, in one of the regions of the world that calls itself or declares itself the Northern Triangle, integrated by 3 countries, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. This is a concept related to security logics and the migration of populations towards the United States, in which the life of women and the life of feminized bodies is not important. It has no value. It is here in which the highest rates of feminicide in the world are situated, and that does not scandalize our society. This does not provoke a reaction corresponding to the gravity, the horror of what we are experiencing. I would like to say that in Honduras, it is prohibited. Emergency anti-contraception is prohibited. And recently, the parliament approved a constitutional reform with which it proposes to lock out any possible modification in order to depenalize abortion. In Guatemala also, during the confinement period for COVID, which was ordered as the principal measure to confront or prevent the contagion of COVID-19. The registers show an increase, a duplication of the pregnancies in children between 10 and 14 years. In El Salvador, the rate of suicide of pregnant girls has become the highest rate of indirect maternal death in the country. Nearby, in our same region, is Nicaragua, where even though it doesn't form part of the Northern Triangle, they're beginning to experience a very serious situation of repression in which the government of Ortega has become feminist movements and feminist organizations and all people who defend human rights into their enemies, and it represses and jails people who have defended human rights. So I'm talking to you from a region in which the crisis was already here before coronavirus, and coronavirus came and made this crisis even more profound. In the case of El Salvador, and here I want to highlight that we have a concentration of countries in which abortion is penalized in an absolute sense. In El Salvador, we saw that this penalization has become an anchor, a point of fusion between the exercise of patriarchal hegemony and neoliberal hegemony, because the control over the reproductive capacities of women has become an element that guarantees control and social submission of women. So we find ourselves in a region in which some rights simply don't exist. We don't hear the voices that would defend them. And those voices that would cry out for those rights are being persecuted, jailed, and assassinated. This is also a region in which we're seeing an increase of authoritarianism justified and used using the health crisis as a pretext. It has served as a justification for the increase of authoritarian practices to control the population. Here, for example, the health crisis has demonstrated the collapse of public services provoked by neoliberal policies that for decades have provoked the pillaging, the precarization, and the privatization of public services. We've seen how hospitals are overflowing, are overwhelmed because of insufficient health personnel, health staff. In their great majority, there's women working in these positions, and the support available in order to confront the impacts of this inequality are reduced to a minimum. In this region and in this country and in El Salvador, women are criminalized for living in situations of poverty. Many of them are very young. If they have obstetric crises, they go to the hospital seeking health support and help, and they find themselves there in the emergency room being denounced. They're considered suspicious of having provoked an abortion, of a miscarriage, and their health issues are not even addressed. Right there in the emergency room, they're criminalized, and this process often leads them to prison, where they confront sentences of 30 or 40 years. It's here in which the conservative and neoconservative sectors, acting often in connivance and complicity with the government, deny rights. Here is also where conservative sectors ally with large corporations and companies acting as de facto authorities in order to quash and suppress feminist organizations and any organization that demands respect for human rights. It's in this region also where often neoconservative sectors speak to us about how we can't hear, we can't listen, we can't receive orientations or declarations from the United Nations because that might orient the government and dictate the respect for human rights. Their arguments in this are the sovereignty and self-determination of the nation. At the same time, they refuse to listen to the need for self-determination of each woman. They don't mind that 10-year-old girls find themselves with imposed pregnancies. Every year, more than 500 girls confront imposed pregnancies and are obliged to become mothers of children who in turn will surely live in poverty and precariousness. I want to say that recently we're accompanying one little girl. She's 12 years old, who's blind. She was raped and she was obliged to carry out the pregnancy. We did manage, in the case of this one girl, to follow through a court case, denounce her aggressor, and get a sentence for that aggressor. But this is so sad because this child, 12 years old, blind, with a severe visual discapacity, and her new child are in the in the care of an 80-year-old grandmother, and there's no space in the country to denounce that this child has been subjected to a chain of violations of her human rights. In this country, we've heard the recommendations of the working group on arbitrary detention from the United Nations that recommended to the country that it free those women who are in prison as a result of these processes of criminalization due to obstetric complications. But conservative groups and the government do not listen to that. The conservative groups send messages to the government saying that to listen to these recommendations would be to cede to international interventionism and impede the self-determination of the nation. We are confronting a continuum of violences, of denial of rights, with the argument, on the one hand, that we are one of the countries we represent a moral vanguard, a moral, because we are one of the first countries to include in its national constitution to recognize the human person from the instant they are conceived. And in this regard, they're only interested in the presence of the fetal life, irrespective of the life of the mother. And this, they claim that this puts us in the moral vanguard, and they highlight this as a model that should be followed by other countries. This is the context in which many families, in order to escape from poverty and violence, have only the option of emigrating, migrating towards the United States, where very often they're arrested along the way, they're repressed, and they're forced to return to their communities of origin. Whole communities are now living in situations of famine in which the vulnerability of families that live without access to water, without adequate housing, in which the burden of care and domestic duties for women is increasing radically. Schools have been closed, which means an enormous increase in work, and the prevention of COVID-19 enclosed us in our homes without being able to highlight that that enclosure or confinement increased violence against women within the homes. Many women are dying because of feminicide violence. In this country, we have recently lived the finding of a clandestine, a hidden cemetery where 42 bodies, principally of women, were found. Many of them were murdered after having been, suffering domestic violence in a place called Chalchuapa. Neither the government nor those groups that deny rights have taken this. I'm sorry.
Could you wrap up in 2 minutes, please? Thank you.
Sí, cómo no, insisten.
They insist that there's no need for conducting autopsies on these women in order to demonstrate the relationship between sexual violence and feminicide. So this is the place where we're fighting every day, where we celebrate the freedom of women. 51 women that had been criminalized, we've managed to get them out of prison. This is the place where women go directly from the hospital to the prison, and yet feminist organizations are celebrating each conquest of their liberty. We celebrate internationalist feminism, in which we hope that there's a inter-American human rights court could soon issue a ruling on the case of Manuela, looking for transformative reparations for a woman who was criminalized, who died in the prison, and which reflects a reality that is not only a reality in El Salvador, but also in many other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. So understanding how anti-rights organizations work and how they impact the decisions of those organizations that guarantee human rights, this gives us strength and pushes us to continue fighting for our rights. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Morena. Thank you so much for that really powerful intervention. You drew the connections between neoliberal capitalism and the actions of neoconservative actors very clearly, and provided us with a very specific country context in which this is playing out. And thank you for leaving us on a hopeful note that highlights the importance of onward action, as well as the upcoming Manuela's case at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which might lead to a really important breakthrough. Before I hand over to our next panelist, I wanted to encourage all our wonderful participants, and we're really it's really great to see such a full house and so much interest from all of you on this topic. As Morena rightly pointed out, we are all starting from building transnational feminist solidarities. So in that spirit, I would really encourage all of you to please use the chat function to send in your comments and reflections. Some of your thoughtful comments are already coming in, and also use the Q&A button to share any questions that you may have for our panelists. With that said, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Melissa Upreti. Melissa is the chair of the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls. A human rights lawyer and women's rights advocate, she has spent nearly 2 decades advocating for women's rights. She has led fact-finding missions, undertaken strategic litigation, built the capacity of civil society organizations, and provided technical support for law reform to governments in Asia. So I turn to you now, Melissa, speaking to your most recent report on sexual and reproductive health and rights that specifically addresses some of the issues that Morena raised about the instrumentalization of the COVID-19 crisis, and how you as a mandate holder are seeing the actions of anti-rights actors at the UN. We would be grateful for your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Ishita. Dear colleagues and participants in today's webinar, I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to participate in this discussion on behalf of the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls. I'm very pleased to be here today with you to engage in a conversation about how to ensure the universality of human rights and push back against the organized infiltration of anti-rights actors within the UN system. As often highlighted by the Working Group, including in our latest thematic report, progress towards gender equality and women's and girls' sexual and reproductive rights has been under attack worldwide in the context of rising religious fundamentalisms and backlash. In our new report on women's and girls' sexual and reproductive health rights in crisis, presented to the Human Rights Council on June 25th, we highlight key factors and trends that undermine and threaten the sexual and reproductive health and autonomy of women and girls before and during a crisis. These include discriminatory laws, policies, and practices, failure by states to prioritize sexual and reproductive health rights, lack of investment in sexual and reproductive health services, lack of legal accountability, lack of support for feminist and women's rights organizations, and violence against women human rights defenders, exclusion of women and girls from decision-making processes, lack of engagement and accountability of men and male allies, and the ideological and religious opposition to sexual and reproductive health rights. Now, with regard to the ideological and religious opposition to sexual and reproductive health rights, in our new report, we do note, among other things, that religious fundamentalists and their political allies have indeed led an organized and well-funded global political backlash against gender equality by invoking religious freedom and traditional values. There has indeed been an increased use of religion or belief by certain actors in all regions of the world to advocate for the imposition of laws and policies that directly or indirectly discriminate against women and girls. We have taken the view that arguments framed in terms of cultural diversity and freedom of religion cannot be invoked to justify discrimination against women. Discriminatory, repressive, and violent practices against women must be eliminated, whatever their origins, including those founded in certain interpretations of religion or culture. In recent years, the backlash has been propelled by some governments, including at the Human Rights Council, by challenging the universality of human rights. This development is central to the working group's concerns about the neglect and deprioritization of women's and girls' sexual and reproductive health rights in all situations, including in times of crisis. A core strategy of the organized opposition has been to undermine women's sexual and reproductive health rights as a whole by using their ideological opposition to abortion as a linchpin. We emphasize that women's and girls' sexual and reproductive health rights, including the option to safely terminate a pregnancy, must be fully recognized and supported at all times to guard against profound violations of their bodily integrity and autonomy. More recently, some states have misleadingly alleged that proponents of gender equality are advancing a harmful, quote-unquote, gender ideology to deepen the instrumentalize the ideological divide and undermine legally guaranteed protections. So speaking of crisis situations, in our report, we do acknowledge that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought about global economic strife and triggered multiple local and individual crises against a backdrop of countless pre-existing crises, and women and girls have been disproportionately affected by them all. In the context of the current pandemic, some countries have restricted access to sexual and reproductive health services, including access to contraception and safe abortion, which have been deemed non-essential. And further rollbacks of existing laws and policies have been attempted. In some countries, there has been a documented increase in obstetric violence, and the widely reported surge in gender-based violence has produced sexual and reproductive health outcomes which are not even being accounted for. The number of unplanned pregnancies is expected to increase by several million due to COVID-19 and its associated containment measures. We emphasize that no country can be truly prepared for or recover from a crisis if the structural inequalities and gaps that deny women and girls access to the full range of sexual and reproductive health information, goods, and services, and which undermine their autonomy persist. The risks and harms that women and girls face in relation to their sexual and reproductive health must not be treated as unavoidable tragedies or collateral damage. They must be recognized as the outcomes of policy failures and as indicative of serious human rights violations. We note that crisis-related events can indeed trigger additional difficulties. Health systems that are already deficient in the provision of essential sexual and reproductive health services often struggle with the breakdown of health infrastructure, while financial and human resources are diverted away from the provision of sexual and reproductive healthcare services. Some groups of women and girls face compounded barriers and threats due to multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, such as, for example, although not limited to, those living with disabilities, residing in rural areas, migrant, refugee, and internally displaced women and girls, and adolescent girls. There are also groups of women and girls who have been living in what we describe as a persistent state of crisis, as a consequence of a history of oppression, exclusion, and discrimination, as well as systematic violence and disregard for their culture, spirituality, and traditions, notably Indigenous women and girls of African descent, and Roma women and girls. The root causes of these disparities must be recognized and addressed. We believe that it is not a lack of resources or technical knowledge, but the widespread disregard for women's dignity, bodily integrity, and autonomy that underlies the neglect of the sexual and reproductive health rights of women and girls. And this is being fueled by opposition to the recognition and fulfillment of their basic human rights. We believe that there is an urgent need for a radical shift in the approach to understanding and dealing with crises, which must center on women and girls, be responsive and intersectional, and acknowledge the hidden trauma and lifelong, as well as intergenerational consequences associated with the non-fulfillment of women and girls' sexual and reproductive health rights. countering conservative forces has to be part of this response. As such, in our new report, we recommend that member states actively push back against conservative, religious, and racialized political ideologies that undermine gender equality, that they oppose misinformation and religious positions that subvert women's and girls' sexual and reproductive health rights, that they ensure that international aid and assistance, including humanitarian assistance, is provided and operationalized in accordance with human rights standards and prioritizes respect for women's and girls' human rights without harmful restrictions, that they support the UN system in countering religious ideologies opposing women's and girls' sexual and reproductive health rights, and ensure that UN processes are conducted with full respect for these rights, that they themselves refrain from using political and financial influence with states and non-state actors to undermine and roll back women's and girls' rights by leading or supporting ideological agendas that are antithetical to human rights norms. I am pleased to say that the interventions during the introductive dialogue on June 25th at the Human Rights Council, where we presented this report and our findings and recommendations, were generally positive. The majority of speakers echoed our findings. A minority of 3 states alleged that our report contained, quote unquote, certain controversial elements that did not reflect universally agreed language, and that sexual and reproductive health rights are not enshrined in international instruments. One of those states also added that religious belief should not be linked to discrimination against women. We reiterated that under international law, neither cultural diversity nor freedom of religion can be used as a pretext to justify discrimination against women. Now, in relation to the role of special procedures and opportunities, as an independent voice within the UN system, special procedures indeed have a key role to play in curbing the influence of anti-rights actors by consistently reaffirming human rights standards and principles, as well as the obligations of member states, and calling for their implementation. One of the weaknesses that we see of the UN system, including its intergovernmental bodies, is inadequate coordination and cooperation. We regret, for instance, that women's health, economic empowerment, and political participation, for example, are too often tackled as separate issues, which really undermines the interrelatedness and interdependence of human rights. A holistic approach to advancing women's human rights, specifically by eliminating gender-based discrimination and violence in both the public and private spheres, with a strong focus on legal accountability and an intersectional approach, one that recognizes the human rights violations experienced across a person's life cycle, as well as the structural root causes and the impact of multiple forms of discrimination, is often lacking. Special procedures routinely produce thematic reports, and it is important for member states to take the recommendations issued by special procedures seriously. Calls for implementation and compliance can be led by civil society, which can help strengthen awareness at all levels and promote accountability. Special procedures have been playing a crucial role in influencing national processes, in particularly through country visits, during which we have the opportunity to engage directly with a range of actors at the national and local levels and witness what is happening locally. And there is more potential for impact. A country visit ends with a formal set of recommendations, which, if implemented, can strengthen compliance with human rights obligations. These reports highlight critical issues and challenges and can be used as a basis for seeking cooperation among allies. These reports also reveal positive and negative trends and can be used to monitor certain types of activities and in the development of strategies. Another tool that we use is communications, including joint communications with other special procedures. And once made public, these can be used for advocacy to expose and challenge acts of regression by member states, including measures that are ideologically or religiously motivated. Special procedures have been a strong voice for human rights defenders, and we have on many occasions noted the particular threats faced by women human rights defenders. In our new report, while calling for measures to increase the participation of women in decision-making processes, as well as to increase support for feminist and women's human rights organizations, we have called on member states to take effective measures to end violence and harassment against human rights defenders advocating for sexual and reproductive health rights, and to ensure the accountability of perpetrators. In fact, a large number of communications that we handle, including joint communications, arise from allegations concerning the mistreatment of.
For interrupting you, could you wrap up, please? Thank you.
Yes, and violence against women human rights defenders. So similarly, national human rights institutions can be a bridge between special procedures and national actors. And I'd just like to say that on several occasions, special procedures have also countered the narratives on gender ideology, and further strategic partnerships are needed to tackle disinformation linked to this campaign. So in conclusion, I'd just like to emphasize that we all have a role to play in creating an enabling and supportive environment. And I'd like to thank the authors of this new report for creating an important resource, and a resource that will be very useful for us as well. It's one that we've used in the past and we will continue to use. And this is also an example of how our engagement can be mutually reinforced. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That was very clear and thoughtful, and gave us a really good picture of the trends that you are seeing. Thank you especially for calling attention to the state obligations to push back against the ideologies that are causing damage to rights related to gender and sexuality and SRHR, as well as for putting this all in the larger context of systemic and structural and historic inequalities that women and certain marginalized groups face, which makes them even more vulnerable in times of crisis such as the pandemic. So thank you so much for that. Before moving on to our final speaker for this evening, I would again call on all of you to please use the chat function and the Q&A function liberally. Many great resources are being shared on it, including the Rights at Risk report that Melissa just referred to. If you are working on any campaigns that are relevant to the topics that are being discussed that we can all support, please feel free to share that. We are also appreciating learning a lot about the specific country contexts that you are working in. So thank you for your engagement, and please continue to share more. With that said, I will move on to our final speaker for the evening, Nada Awad. Nada is the International Advocacy Officer at the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies, where she works on human rights violations in the MENA region. She was previously responsible for the advocacy unit at Al-Quds University's Community Action Center, where she focused on the issue of forcible transfer of Palestinians from Jerusalem. Thank you, Nada, so much for being here with us today. And now zooming out from the international to a specific country context, we're hoping you can take us through the lived realities based on the Palestinian context. Over to you, Nada.
Thank you so much for organizing this webinar, and thank you to the other speakers. As you mentioned, I will be speaking specifically on the situation of Palestine, and in my presentation, I will address Israel's use of the UN and the Human Rights Council to ensure that the international community does not address the root causes of Israel's settler colonialism and apartheid, including by using a narrative where Israel presents itself as, quote unquote, the only democracy in the Middle East, and where it brands itself as a promoter of women and LGBTI rights. In reality, Israel has systematically oppressed the Palestinian people for 73 years and has imposed over the Palestinian people a regime of racial domination and oppression, constituting the crime against humanity of apartheid. If we start by analyzing the discourse, if we start first with Israel promoting itself as supporter of LGBTI rights on the international level as well as in this country. I will start with a quote from a statement that was delivered in a previous Human Rights Council session, where the Israeli delegate said, "This is just another example of the persecution that LGBTIQ people suffer in the Palestinian territories, where no legal protection from discrimination exists, where in Gaza same-sex relations are outlawed. While this is happening, Israel has welcomed Palestinian LGBTIQ asylum seekers fleeing from persecution." In reality, Al-Qaws, which is a Palestinian organization working for sexual and gender diversity in Palestinian society, analyzing this Israeli discourse, stated that over a decade, Palestinian activists adopted this pink-washing discourse to describe how the Israeli state and its supporters use the language of gay and trans rights to direct international attention away from the oppression of Palestinians. And going back to the statements that you can read on this slide, Israel presents itself as the savior. So this Israeli savior myth persists in spite of the obvious contradictions, because what Al-Qaws, the organization, says, pinkwashing works tirelessly to erase the presence of the most formidable opponent, which is a Palestinian queer movement that uncompromisingly merges the fight against colonialism with the fight against patriarchy and capitalist oppression, and which views itself as an integral part of Palestinian society and the anti-colonial struggle. So the idea here is that Israel, while it shows itself as a savior of sexual minority rights, in reality, it has systematically erased the progressive and politicized queer voices, Palestinian queer voices, that serve to serve this interest of the colonial power and its narrative. Al-Qaws stresses that recognizing pinkwashing as a colonial violence can help us understand how Israel divides, oppresses, and erases Palestinians on the basis of gender and sexuality. Now, going back to another point Israel raises a lot in the context of the Human Rights Council. Israel has used the platform of the Human Rights Council to continuously claim anti-Israel bias and to undermine efforts by human rights, civil society, and by human rights defenders to promote the rights of Palestinians in these spaces. So if we go to the third slide, we can see that the Israeli narrative equates the mobilization against Israel's violations with anti-Semitism. A very basic example is this statement, which was delivered in a previous Human Rights Council session, where the mission says, recently we have seen the expansion of hate speech, especially through social media and the discourse of political parties. And then it gives examples of Holocaust denial, appearance of swastikas, and BDS support. BDS, Boycott, Divestment and Sanction, is a human rights movement, a political movement that opposes Israel's colonial settler colonialism and apartheid, and it is shown by Israel as being, in fact, anti-Semitic, which of course it isn't. And this is a narrative that Israel tries to present at the Human Rights Council, where it equates mobilization against the violations it commits with anti-Semitism, and therefore undermining fundamental freedoms, including freedom of expression and association. If we go to the next slide, we can see also that Israel portrays itself as a promoter of women's rights. And in a joint statement delivered this session, Israel spoke of a joint statement with other states. It presented an initiative that it had launched with other countries to eliminate sexual harassment. In its statement in previous session, Israel insisted it promotes, I quote, gender equality and the empowerment of women of all ages and background, and which is considered for Israel a high priority. In fact, the reality is very different. The range of rights violated by Israel's settler colonialism and apartheid places this phenomenon in the category of mass violations of human rights. And these include, just to give examples, the right to adequate housing, the right to property, the right to life, the right to liberty and security of the person, the freedom of movement of Palestinians, and their right to self-determination and permanent sovereignty over their national resources. In the context of the Palestinian patriarchal society, while women continue to play an essential role in the struggle for self-determination, the dominant discourse has sustained that women's rights are a secondary issue that should be addressed after national liberation. And while in this patriarchal society, women essentially carry the responsibility of children, are responsible for the unpaid labor inside the household, they are disproportionately therefore affected and suffer from Israel's settler colonialism and apartheid, including from policies such as house demolitions, forced evictions, and child arrest. I will just expand on one example to show how Israel's apartheid regime and patriarchy both have worked and continue to work together to gravely undermine women's rights. For example, the law, Israeli law, which bans family unification between Palestinians living inside the Green Line and Jerusalem with Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza, is one of the policies aiming at fragmenting Palestinians and attaining demographic objectives. So according to the law, if a Palestinian woman marries a Palestinian man from Jerusalem or inside the Green Line, she can only receive temporary permits to live in these cities, but not a residency status. Only if she fills a list of criteria, including for the woman to be 25 years or more, to even make the application for family unification. If the woman marries before 25, or if the Israeli Ministry of Interior refuses her application, then women living with their husbands in Jerusalem without any legal status, which Israel denies them, will live the fear of being arrested and forcibly transferred. And in Jerusalem, we hear a lot of stories where women facing gender-based violence are unable to go to the Israeli authorities as they do not have a legal status in Jerusalem. In the event they have kids, if they leave their household, they will not be able to see their kids because they are not able to re-enter Jerusalem. So this is just an example of how Israel's settler colonialism policies and patriarchy work together in Palestine. But to go back to Israel trying to promote itself as a democracy and a very pro-rights country, in reality, what we see and what has been recognized more and more, including by the UN, is that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid against the Palestinian people. Since 1947, when the partition plan occurred in Palestine, Israel has been institutionalizing and inscribing in its laws the transfer of Palestinians and the replacement with Jewish Israeli settlers, and that with the objective to establish and maintain an Israeli Jewish demographic majority in the country. Since the Nakba, Israel denies Palestinian refugees and displaced persons the right to return to their homes, lands, and properties. In contrast, it has adopted a law, including the 1950 so-called Law of Return, which grants every Jewish person the exclusive right to enter Israel as a Jewish immigrant. It also adopted laws allowing it to legalize the expropriation of properties of Palestinians who had become refugees or internally displaced, thereby stripping Palestinians of their right to land and property. Israeli laws, policies, and practices, especially regarding land and nationality, were designed, since the creation of the state, to impose Zionist settler colonial domination and oppression over the indigenous Palestinian people. Moreover, Israel's strategic fragmentation of the Palestinian people is a main tool through which it imposes its apartheid regime. Israel has divided the Palestinian people into at least 4 separate geographic, legal, and political categories. And these categories, Israel, through the creation of these categories, Israel has ensured that Palestinian refugees living outside of mandatory Palestine, Palestinians living in the territory that became Israel in 1948, Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank and Gaza, and the Palestinians living in Jerusalem cannot meet, group, live together, and exercise any collective rights, in particular, their right to self-determination. In order to maintain the apartheid regime, Israel imposes policies such as collective punishment, mass arbitrary detention, torture, and it maintains a coercive environment, and finally silences oppositions. These are means used to suppress resistance to apartheid and to subjugate the Palestinian people. If we go to the next slide, we will see the picture of Khalida Jarrar. Khalida, you have heard at the beginning of this session that Suha Jarrar, who used to work at Al-Haq on gender issues in the Palestinian organization Al-Haq, passed away 2 days ago. And Khalida, who is in prison since for going in and out of prison because of Israeli arbitrarily arresting her, was not able to attend her own daughter's funeral today. Khalida is a Palestinian civil society leader. She's a lawmaker and a human rights activist. And she is today arbitrarily detained for her struggle against Israeli violations. For example, as a member of parliament, she contributed to formulating Palestinians' application to this ICC, to the International Criminal Court. And this is just one example of ways of oppression and subjugation of Palestinian women. I will take 2 examples of the international community's role in sustaining Israel's impunity by failing to take effective measures to put an end to Israeli violations. I will start with, in 2018, the United States, which withdrew from the Human Rights Council, citing what it called the Council's anti-Israel bias. The US, but also multiple Western states, have repeatedly called for the removal of Item 7, Agenda Item 7, that deals with the occupied Palestinian territory. However, if we go back to history, the UN is responsible for the 1947 partition of Palestine. The UN partition resulted in wars and crimes being perpetrated against the Palestinian people. But since then, there has been no accountability for the crimes committed. In the 73 years since, the international community, its silence and complicity has enabled Israel to sustain its institutionalized policies of settler colonialism and apartheid. Item 7 should only be removed from the Human Rights Council agenda once the international community has dealt with its responsibility under international law to dismantle Israel's colonialism and apartheid. While we see that dozens of United Nations resolutions have been adopted, including legally binding Security Council resolutions, which have called on Israel to undo its annexation, facilitate the return of refugees, remove its obstruction to realization of Palestinian self-determination, there was no effective measures taken to make Israel comply with its resolution, with the resolutions of the UN. I will now take 2 small examples of accountability that civil society has pushed for and has mobilized around. The first one is the UN database of companies involved in Israel's settlement enterprise. Businesses, as we all know, have played a significant role in sustaining Israel's illegal settlement enterprise. In this context, the Human Rights Council adopted in 2016 a resolution mandating the OHCHR.
Sorry to interrupt you. Would you please wrap up?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mandating the OHCHR to create a list of companies and to publish it, and to update it every year. However, the database, while it was published, one report was published after 3 years due to political pressure, the database is an important step in addressing the economic incentive structure perpetuating Israeli occupation. Also, it is a tangible mechanism strengthening the implementation of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. The decision whether to annually update the UN database is an important test for the credibility of the UN Human Rights Council. If the UN Human Rights Council succumbs to political pressure regarding this mandate, it would imply that states and corporate interests override human rights. I will stop here and maybe I can discuss the COI later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nada. I really appreciate that powerful and thoughtful presentation that highlights how an entire state is constantly acting as an anti-rights actor and creating this situation of acute rightslessness for Palestinians. Thank you for your courageous words and your work. So we are drawing to the end of our conversation today, and we did say we would make space for Q&As. So we've received some questions, and I will share these with the panelists. And then please feel free to unmute yourself and respond if you think you have something to say. So the first question, also referencing one of the first comments we received from Kay from New Zealand, was about the lack of a quote unquote glue that holds together all of us organizing against anti-rights actors, whereas those who have anti-rights ideologies seem to be able to come together in a very organized way. And what one of our attendees would like to hear from all of you is, what is this glue that can bring together all of those, all of us who are organizing to uphold human rights and be more united? So this is a question from Arushi, and over to you, our speakers, to respond.
Maybe I can go first as the first speaker, and then I definitely invite Melissa, Nada, and also Morena to give their input. I think this is a very important and interesting question, because I think at many levels there can be a feeling that we're constantly focused on resistance and while the advancing element can feel a bit missing, but at the same time, I think, number one, it's really important to reiterate that we are united in the front, that our principles and also our organizing is based on an expansive view of rights, and on the fact that it's based in solidarity, it's based in support, it's based in care, as opposed, and this is, I think, the one thing that glues ourselves together. And so, for example, I think within our own communities, we have these kind of realities, or we so call it feminist realities, being lived in our everyday lives. We have diverse forms of family that are really that are formed, that are actually existing within this context. And I think one thing that like a lot of our members of the Hours Working Group are doing, such as Musawa, are really pushing forward, or like showing that religion, culture, and tradition is not owned by anti-rights groups, and it's owned by us very specifically. So I think that that's one way to unite, and I think we have those kind of expansive ideas of rights and also principles in our own realities, and also the way that we organize among ourselves. So I'd invite everyone else to speak.
Yes, I can say a few words. I think with regard to the question about the glue and where that might come from, I think as pointed out, I think Umira, it was you pointed out the big disadvantage that a lot of feminist and women's rights organizations, those advocating for gender equality, face, which is the lack of resources, right? When you compare the level of funding available for these groups versus the amount of dark money that has been made available from different sources, and including some governments as well. There is public funding that goes towards activities that are not always geared towards promoting and advancing human rights, but are actually advancing some of the agendas that we're questioning, the campaigns, whether it be gender ideology campaigns or any campaign that is centered around instrumentalizing women's bodies and is antithetical to human rights. So I think that that's a big disadvantage. So addressing that gap is really important. And that's also why in our report, we also very specifically made the point that there is a need for an increase in resources to feminist and women's rights organizations. And the Generation Equality Forum just happened. A lot of commitments have been made. Of course, the current funding systems are flawed, so it'll be important to see how that money is dispersed. But hopefully, there will be more resources for organizations that are champions of gender equality, because there is definitely a need for more engagement. I mean, at the end of the day, women are not a monolithic group, women, girls, and other persons, right? There's so much diversity and difference of opinion, as well as need and perspectives. And I think we need to have the opportunity to engage more and to really understand each other's perspectives, and then to build strategies, and then to start connecting. CSOs connecting with mechanisms, and connecting with champion member states. And we need to have the opportunity to develop these strategies. So in order to create that space, there is also a need for resources, financial resources, as well as time. We know with COVID, it's been incredibly challenging on the one hand, because we can't meet in person anymore. But on the other hand, we have been able to engage online. But then there's the whole reality of the increased burden of a lot of family unpaid care work on women, etc. So there are many barriers need to be addressed, but I think a starting point can really be to demand an increase in resources for organizations, so that we can also have the opportunity to engage, listen to each other more, and then to actually strategize and then take action together.
Thank you, Melissa. And if I can invite Morena and Nada to comment from their specific country contexts, if they have any strategies or recommendation in terms of alliance building and solidarity building, that would be wonderful. So can I invite Morena first, and then perhaps Nada?
Bueno, muchas gracias. Miren,
of course, thank you. When in a country, it's very difficult that one might access justice, then international levels, which provide a guarantee of the recognition of human rights, becomes the only life raft. That's the way we see the United Nations system and the Inter-American human rights system from the point of view from El Salvador. The UN human rights system is very important for the recognition of rights in our country, and for the recognition that these rights are being violated in a systematic way. In the specific case of the absolute penalization of abortion, we need organizations like the Human Rights Council to formally recognize and to tell the Salvador government that to oblige a child to go through with a pregnancy that is the result of a rape is to exercise torture on that person for her entire life, because it's not only the 9 months of gestation, it's throughout her entire, it will mark the life of that child. It marks the life of the family and of the community. We need spaces like the United Nations to not only recognize formally the concept of feminicide, but also the pathways of systemic violence that lead to that extreme form of violence. We also need them to commit to the need to construct non-hegemonic masculinities, masculinities not based in violence, that might establish different relationships with the women with whom they live. I think the international community, the formal entities, play an important role in this. I've seen these, I see that these structures are very far from the lived realities that we are experiencing. And yet I do have faith in the Inter-American Human Rights Court's upcoming rulings, and in general in the global human rights system, in order to acknowledge that women's human rights exist, that the lives of women not be denied, and that these countries suffer some kind of sanction. I coincide with Melissa in the need for the international community to commit to those organizations that defend human rights, to commit themselves in terms of recognition and also in terms of support with resources, economic resources, but also other kinds of resources like information that they're providing, that the Human Rights Observatory is providing. Thank you.
Nada, please go ahead.
Thank you. Just to add that on the attack on funding, this is something, of course, that is very real in Palestine, and there are a lot of laws by Israel to ensure that Palestinian human rights organizations are not able to work. And the attack is also by pro-Israeli organizations lobbying European states and others to stop the funding that goes to human rights organizations working towards accountability, including on the ICC and cases, etc. So this is very real as well on cases of the struggle against settler colonialism in Israel. And what we have seen from the work we have been conducting on Palestine is that there is a lot of connections with other struggles. Of course, the feminist struggle, of course, struggles against colonialism in general. And this has been a very important network where organizations are supporting, including the UN database, which I spoke about, but also the Commission of Inquiry. And what has been very important is, for example, in the Commission of Inquiry, it's the first time the Commission on Palestine is mandated to address root causes. And this is a very positive development in the sense that we're not only looking at symptoms of violations, but to address the root causes of the issue, which is settler colonialism and apartheid. And also what is important in this Commission of Inquiry is that for the first time, it is looking at Palestinians on both sides of the Green Line. So not as if Israeli policies are only targeting the OPT, but they target Palestinians as a whole, as a people. And so this addressing root causes is a very important, I think, call that has been made by different civil societies, including on other issues that should be much more, I guess, used in the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nada, and thank you so much to all of our wonderful panelists for sharing your wide array of knowledge and experience with all of us. As you would have seen from the lively chat, your interventions were very deeply appreciated. So thank you for being here with us today. I would also like to thank our wonderful interpreters and our tech support team who have made this webinar go smoothly. And lastly, I would like to reiterate that the resources produced by the Observatory have been shared in the chat, as well as our call to action. We would really appreciate it if you download both these resources and stay in conversation with us and continue to build transnational feminist solidarities. Thank you so much.